Too many characters on the page feel dead. They feel lifeless and lackluster. But if you don't want to fall into that mistake and you want to make sure your characters have life and vigor and verve, then I would recommend running them through this 7-step process. I built this process off the advice of famous authors, and I came up with this visual to help you sort of imagine what these 7 steps are. Are you ready? Let's get started with number 1. Exaggerate your character's personality. This first step in the process comes from Donald Moss in his book, Writing the Breakout Novel. So he argues that if you really want your book to sell a lot of copies and be this, breakout success, then your main character needs to have a little extra personality, if you know what I mean. They can't just be normal, everyday Joe or Jane. They need to have a big personality. So I'd recommend doing this exercise for your character. Write down each of their main personality traits. Rank them, say, from 0 to 10. And then why don't you see how you can just push them to be a little bit more extreme with each one of those traits? If they're at a 5 or a 6, can you push it to more of a 9 or a 10? You could even, in the famous lines of This is Spinal Tap, dial it up to 11. So let's look at some famous examples of characters whose personalities did seem exaggerated and larger than life. Look at Stag Larsson's The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, specifically Lisbeth Salander. Now, Salander could have been written as merely smart, but no. Larsson decided to exaggerate her character and give her a photographic memory and make her this brilliant hacker who could get any information that she wants. Now, he could have also written her as being frustrated and resentful, but no, he exaggerated those extremes and gave her this sort of boundless capacity for revenge and torture. And for another example, look at John Kennedy Toole's A Confederacy of Dunces, specifically at the character of Ignatius J. Reilly. This is possibly the most exaggerated character in all of American literature. This is a guy who just thinks of himself as being the greatest thing ever, is just such grandiose notions of himself. But that he's also lazier than you could possibly imagine and has tons of moral outrage, all directed in the completely wrong direction. So that's the first step in building your character. Now let's get to the second step, which is add character contrasts. This piece of advice comes from Jane K. Cleland's Mastering Plot Twists. So after you've exaggerated a character's personality, what you want to do is you want to create a second character who is the opposite of that character's personality. For instance, if your main character is suspicious of absolutely everything and everyone, okay, then try to create a counterpoint character who is the complete opposite of that, who is very warm and trusting. And we see this character contrasting in so many famous books. Look at the contrast between, say, Hermione and Luna Lovegood. One is this rigid rule follower, and the other one is this unconventional dreamer. Or look at Walter White and Jesse Pinkman. White ends up being a very cold and canny calculator, while Jesse is just sort of a bundle of emotional chaos for most of the series. Or look at Elphaba and Glinda in Wicked. Elphaba is serious, she's passionate, she's principled, and she certainly can be blunt. Glinda, on the other hand, is frivolous. I mean, she's a people pleaser, she's vain, but she's also charming at the same time. What adding a character contrast does is that it highlights the features of the first character. Sometimes someone doesn't feel very weird until you set them next to a normal person, and then they feel super weird in contrast. Also, having these opposite characters gives you a lot of possibilities for friction and for conflict in your storyline. Hey, I know you're enjoying these YouTube videos, but I do have 2 additional ways that I can help you write your book. First one is Bookfox Academy. It's 10 courses that you can take at your own pace that will accelerate your writing life and make you into a writing genius. And the second one is Bookfox Lab, which is my one-on-one mentorship and coaching program, which will help guide you through the entire process of writing your book. And I will put links to both of those in the description below so you can check them out. Now let's move on to the next step in this process, which is step number 3, appearances with depth. So you don't want to be one of those type of authors who, halfway through the book, you finally get around to describing the main character and all your readers are like, what? I was imagining them with different colored hair this whole time. But I should also say that your character's appearance shouldn't just be meaningless, right? It should actually connect to who they are as a person. Now you have 2 basic strategies here. The first one is to play into type, and the second one is to play against type. Now, if you want your character's appearance to play into type, well, this would be Alan Richson done in the Jack Reacher novels. You know, he's this 6'5", 230-pound guy, just this massive dude, and you would expect that of a guy like him who goes around engaging in physical combat and got out of the US military. Side note, that's why a lot of people got angry when Tom Cruise was chosen as Jack Reacher, and Alan Ritchson is obviously a much better choice. Now, the second way to think about the appearance of your character is to play against type. So let's look at Tyrion Lannister from Game of Thrones. Yes, he is a dwarf, but that's exactly in contrast to who he is as a person. He's sort of this giant of intellect. He's so canny and smart and can figure out all these different strategies, but that's very much at odds with how diminutive he is as a person. Now, a third option, and this one's a little bit more complex, is to both play into and against type at the same time. Look at Beast in X-Men. On one level, he embodies what you would think of when you hear the word beast, right? He is hairy, he is muscular, he is also blue. But then at the same time, he's also playing against type because he's frequently wearing this suit and appears very cultured and refined. So you sort of get the best of both sides of the spectrum with a character like that. Okay, so we have exaggerated our character, we've created a character who's the opposite, and we now know what the character looks like. So what's the next step? It's to see the character in action. So step number 4, making moral attempts and moral mistakes. So you need both of these elements. You want your hero doing something good so that the readers can identify with them and like them as a character, but you also need to make sure they're making some sort of mistake in the story as well. So for the moral attempts, make sure your character is trying to solve a problem. Give them agency, make them active, have them trying to do something. But the flip side of that, moral mistakes, is what John Truby argues in The Anatomy of Story. Now, you might think that, oh, a character who's making moral mistakes might not be a hero, right? That'd be more of an antagonist or a villain. But, you know, even when you have a good character, they should be fallible in some way. Let's look at Queen's Gambit by the author Walter Tevis, later made into that Netflix miniseries. So Beth Harmon makes a good moral attempt to get out of the orphanage and get out of the, you know, huge valley of her life by trying to learn chess and playing it in a really good, honest way, not cheating, not trying to cut corners. But on the flip side, what is her moral failure? Well, she gets addicted to tranquilizers and booze. And this leads to a whole bunch of other mistakes. After the death of Miss Wheatley, she doesn't reach out and she just isolates. She ends up drinking heavily before a big chess match and shows up hungover. And she also ends up discarding a lot of the people who are closest to her, like her friend in the orphanage, Jolene, and her peer and mentor, Benny, and also the person who taught her chess, Shaibol the janitor. Now, as readers, should we be sympathetic to your character's moral failings? Yes, right? You don't want them to do something so heinous and so unforgivable that it will turn the reader against them. But they still need something that the reader can be like, that was a mistake. I mean, I understand and I forgive you for it, but that was certainly a mistake. Hey, there are more than 200,000 authors inside the Bookfox community on YouTube, and I'd love to hear from you what sort of videos you think we should be doing next. So hit like, hit subscribe, and then leave a comment for what you think are the topics we should cover next. This 5th step is a roundabout way to get to a universal truth. You'll see what I mean when I talk about number 5, your character's wound. Now, you might know Angela Ackerman for The Emotion Thesaurus. It's probably her most famous book, but she also has an offshoot book called The Emotional Wound Thesaurus, a writer's guide to psychological trauma. And in it, she talks a lot about having backstory wounds for your character. How has your character been wounded by their past? Now, let me say really, really clearly that a sad backstory is not a wound. And writers mess up on this all the time. A wound is something that keeps happening in this character's life because it's distorting how they're acting in the present moment. And for an example of this, look at Little Fires Everywhere by Celeste Ng. So Mia was this young artist who agreed to be a surrogate for this wealthy family, the Ryans. But after her brother dies and then her parents disown her, she just can't give up the baby. She took Pearl and ran, and they've been on the run for years. So that is her backstory. That is her backstory wound. So how does this affect her present? Well, for one, she's very distrusting of other people. She's very wary. 2, they're constantly moving. They never stay in one location for very long. So all their relationships are kind of shallow because, 6 months later, they change everything and move to a different town. And also, it really affects the relationship with her daughter because she's keeping this all a secret and hasn't told her daughter what happened. Now, it's a really common mistake with writers to always go for the huge wound. You know, they got molested or they witnessed a murder or something like that. And I just want to say that it's perfectly fine to have quieter wounds as well. Say you have a father figure who's very emotionally distant, or say your character has a friendship that ended over a misunderstanding. Those aren't like the most massive things, but they feel big to that character and they can still impact who they are in the present moment. So choose some huge wounds, choose some smaller, quieter wounds. Either way, just make sure they have a backstory wound. Okay, only 2 steps left in this 7-step process. Let's look at number 6. Apply the force field of character change. So you guys know that your characters need to change, right? This isn't new information, you've heard this before, but I think James Scott Bell in his book Plot and Structure has a very interesting way of approaching this idea. He argues that character change only comes about through challenges, through the character getting challenged by obstacles. Why? Because characters don't like changing, right? Just like we don't like changing. Changing is difficult and it hurts. So James Scott Bell came up with a force field of character change. And basically pressure is coming or challenges are coming from the outside, but to force your character to really change, you have to get past those outer layers and penetrate to the inner layers. But the real trouble is that a lot of authors only have their characters change on the outer level, which is, it's kind of superficial. Opinions, attitudes, I mean, this is minor level changes. The real change comes at that center, which is about their core beliefs and about their self-image. So let's look at an example of this. We're going to look at Ebenezer Scrooge from Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. Each one of the 3 ghosts penetrate a little bit further into this force field. The first ghost helps him change his opinions. He sees old Fezziwig, which was his old boss, and he thinks like, oh, you know, maybe I should be a little bit nicer to Cratchit. The second ghost penetrates a little bit further, and Scrooge is going to change his attitudes and values. He realizes that he sent children to prisons and workhouses and starts to realize that his values are not healthy ones. And then finally, the third ghost penetrates all the way to his core beliefs and his self-image. This is when he visits his own gravestone and he really realizes how despised he will be after his own death, and that he caused in no small part Tiny Tim's death. That shakes him to his very core, right? His absolute essential understanding of himself. And that's when he makes that big character change and, you know, transforms into a generous person. My recommendation is to take your characters and look at this force field and ask yourself, how deep does my story really penetrate to their sense of self? Are you at the outer levels, or do you have something which shocks them to their core and really makes them reevaluate who they are as a person? Okay, now it's time for the very last and final step in this process. It is number 7. Invert your characters. We spent most of this 7-step process helping you show the reader who your character is. But what's different about steps number 6 and number 7 is that now that we've established that, we can start to tweak who your character is. And that's what the process of inversion is. Let me ask you a question. Is there any point in your story when your character is going to act unlike themselves? Now, it's very important to set up beforehand what your character is like, right? Because if the reader doesn't know what your character is like, we don't realize when they're acting out of character. But once you have established who they are as a person, then you have this great opportunity to have them do something which is like, whoa, I didn't know you were capable of that. Deborah Spark wrote this craft book for writers called And Then Something Happened. And in it, she gives 2 examples of this inversion of characters. She talks about how in Sega's Half the Kingdom, there is a white woman who watches this black woman jump off of a roof and commit suicide, and she does nothing. She doesn't call anyone. She doesn't reach out to anyone. And it's like, whoa. Who is this character? I would not have predicted they would be so calloused. But then Spark tells an opposite type of story, drawing from This American Life, about this guy who's super cranky and cantankerous, but what he does is he saves someone from suicide. He runs up and like pulls this person from jumping off. So in both of these examples, we have characters who are doing the opposite of what we'd expect. The good character who isn't doing the right thing when they witness a suicidal jumper. And then we have the antagonist of the story who ends up saving the jumper. So let me just say this. If you do not have characters who can act against type and surprise the reader, then you really don't have flesh and blood people. You have cardboard cutouts on a page. In Red Rising by Pierce Brown, we have a main character who's living in this Romanesque pagan society where might makes right. All that matters is power, which is why it's so shocking when he completely upends that whole philosophy and way of life and sort of inverts even what he had been going for in terms of power and volunteers himself to be whipped in front of his team. And it's not even because he did something wrong. He's volunteering to have himself whipped because someone else did something wrong. It's this crazy, Judeo-Christian value of self-sacrifice inserting itself into a Roman worldview of, only might makes right. It honestly was one of the most shocking parts of that whole book, and it really inverted what we thought we knew about that character. So don't forget to click the links below to Bookfox Academy and Bookfox Lab. I would love to work with you. I would love to help you write the best book you possibly can. And also, I really hope you jotted down some notes from this little video so you can remember these 7 steps and how to really take your character from being this, lifeless character on the page to being a real flesh and blood human.